Okay. Well, we're at 6:04, everyone. I'm gonna get us started here and just um, share the screen here with everybody. So thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate your interest in this. My name is Jason Lichty. I'm the Director of Policy and Zoning for Alderwoman Ruth Cruz. And I just want to welcome everybody. I'm your moderator tonight, so if I get distracted at any point, it's because I'm trying to manage a couple of things, and so please bear with me. Um, we will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end, but first I'm just going to share my screen so everyone can see this. So obviously our intro. But tonight we've got a really distinguished speaker with us, and that's Ralph Martiri, Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. But here's a quick agenda. Just I'm going to do some introductions and mention the ground rules. Alderwoman Cruz will welcome everyone. We'll hear from Ralph. Then we'll have a good length of time for question and answer, and then we'll close. When it comes to the question and answer, you can feel free during the chat at any time to use the chat, and that's one of the buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen here, the first circled button that you see here that says chat. If you click that, a chat window should open up for you on the right-hand side of the screen, and you should be able to chat, um, enter your questions in the chat. And then at the last few minutes, maybe 10 minutes before we close, I know not everyone is necessarily as comfortable with using the chat, so we'll have a chance for folks to ask the questions live as well. And to do that, we'll have you click on the React button, and then as you see the second from the bottom, it says raise hand. And so we'll do it by raise of hand there. Otherwise, trying to have everybody unmute and ask questions is just could be very chaotic. So we're going to try it this way. We're always learning from our methods, but look forward to hearing from folks what you're thinking and wanting to know more about. So I'll stop sharing here at this point, just so we all come back. But I want to take this opportunity to introduce Ralph. He is the executive director for the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, which is also CTBA, which is a nonpartisan think tank, 501(c)(3) organization committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just, and promote opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income. He's also the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. During his time at CTBA, Ralph has helped obtain numerous legislative successes, including passage of the evidence-based model of education funding in fiscal year 2018, a state earned income tax credit, creation of a bipartisan legislative task force to integrate workforce and economic development policies, and corporate accountability legislation. He was also appointed to the transition team of Governor J.B. Pritzker. In addition to his professorship at Roosevelt, he has taught fiscal policy seminars and education finance courses for various universities and the International Fulbright Scholar Program. Ralph has received numerous awards for his work. There's a long list here, which I encourage you to check out on the CTBA website, but I will highlight that one of those, the 2007 Champion of Freedom Award presented by the Rainbow Push Coalition to individuals whose professional work embodies Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to equal educational opportunities, which is a really outstanding recognition. He also received the Adlai Stevenson Award for Public Service from the American Society for Public Administration for making outstanding contributions to government and public administration over an extended period of time in the Chicago area. Ralph is also a regular columnist for many newspapers. You may have seen him not that long ago in the Sun Times, but I know he's also been in the Tribune and newspapers around the country. Helping out tonight will be Annie Rojas from CTBA. She's going to be running the slideshow for Ralph. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Alderwoman Cruz. Alderwoman, let me unmute you.
Well, thank you, Jason. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alderwoman Ruth Cruz, and today we're honored to have Ralph Martiri with us this evening, as Jason was able to share with us all of his experience, and he's an expert on tax policy. And again, we're honored to have him with us this evening. Ralph have done other budget town halls also with other my colleagues, such as Matt Martin. Do want to say thank you for being with us this evening, Ralph. But also thank to all of you for taking time this evening to learn more about the process. So our purpose for tonight is for you to learn the budget process. What happens during the budget process? What are the components of the budget? And then what happens when it comes to negotiations, and what happened when the key role play the city council has when it comes to the budget. But also at the end, allow for questions for you to address some concerns, things that you like about the budget, or again, just ask questions about the things that you're unsure of. This is, we want to create that space for allow all of you to be able to, again, not only learn, but have the opportunity to share your opinion as well. So on October 16, the Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson proposed his 2026 budget. After the proposed budget, then there's the city council held budget hearings for 3 weeks. And during these 3 weeks, we have the opportunity to meet with commissioners and city department leaders to talk about many different things, not only focus on the budget when it comes to efficiencies, cuts, but also focus on day-to-day operations, and also focus on what are some of the legislation they're working on or have worked in the past year to impact their departments. Once that is done, then couple many different things could happen. This time on Monday, November 17th, the Finance Committee voted down the mayor's budget. And when it comes to the Finance Committee, there's 35 members. Not all City Council members are part of the Finance Committee, as we have to select the community committees we want to be part of. We can't be part of all the committees. It's just impossible. But there's 35 members, which some of you may already have known. 10 voted in favor and 25 opposed the budget. So what happens now? Now we have more time for negotiations. Now we have more time to propose ideas, also question some of the information that is given. But eventually we will have to pass a budget by December 31st. We want to make sure we are fiscally responsible with this budget, and also not to have what we have experienced in the federal government, which is a budget, you know, I got stuck on that one, but we want to make sure that we pass that budget by December 31st. So now, without further ado, I will pass it over to Ralph so he can walk us through the evening, and at the end, we can go ahead and answer any questions that you all might have. So thank you.
Great. I'm getting all these notices from Zoom about who's running the show and stuff now, so I'm trying to click those off. So while Annie gets the PowerPoint presentation up, first thing I want to do is thank Alderwoman Cruz for holding this event. I think there's nothing more important for any public sector entity than its budget and the passage of the budget. It really shows you where priorities are and how things get financed. And I also think there's nothing more poorly covered in the media than the city of Chicago's budget and its budget issues, and the interrelationship between the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, and how policy is very much made at the state level that neither the city council nor the mayor have any control over. And what I'm going to try to do today as I run through this stuff, and I'm not going to go through every piece of information, every slide, but we will distribute this slideshow to Alderwoman Cruz so anyone who wants access to this data can have it. But the bottom line is, what we want to do is give you a good understanding of the real challenges facing the city council, facing the mayor, and in fact, avoid the blame game and just focus on what sort of policy options truly are available, truly aren't available to deal with these problems. So if you go to the first slide, one of the top things, look, this is a lot of information here, but these are the different revenue sources that feed the corporate fund for the city of Chicago. And frequently in the media, the media talks about the Chicago budget as this giant budget, $16 billion. No, Chicago has 6 budgets. The corporate fund is its general operating budget. It's only about $6 billion. And the entire deficit is in that corporate fund. Okay. And these show you the revenue sources that feed the corporate fund. as they would be if the mayor gets all of his proposals that he recently put on the table to generate that $6 billion in revenue. So if you think about a $1.2 billion hole in a $6 billion budget, that's a 20% operating deficit. That's not sustainable. And that's not something that you can deal with easily. And then if you look at the revenue sources that feed the corporate fund, one thing that should jump out to you is there's not very many economically based taxes that feed this budget. In fact, the biggest revenue source are transaction taxes, which are things like the real estate property tax, the personal property lease transaction tax, which includes not just regular personal property, but things like cloud services and computer stuff, and motor vehicle lesser tax. That's the biggest revenue source for the city of Chicago's general operating fund. Most of these revenue sources do not grow with the economy over time. They simply don't. But what will grow with the economy over time is the cost of providing public services. So if you go to the next slide, Annie, we could give a quick summary of what public services are covered by the corporate fund. Here you see how the corporate fund is supposed to spend its money in the upcoming year, and this really pretty much follows every year for the city of Chicago. And if you'll notice, the biggest line item in there is public safety, police and fire. You also have streets and sands. You have a couple of other things with confusing names, so I'm going to talk about those a little bit. You see this category called general financing requirements. So that includes citywide operating expenses that aren't assigned to specific departments, so the city just pays for them. It covers pension and employee benefits. It covers certain debt service payments. It covers interest and principal on bonds, financing costs, and other large sort of citywide expenses like medical claims and certain administrative functions. So that's a big catch-all category that covers a lot of different things. Finance and administration, which has a confusingly similar name on the expenditure side, is slightly different. It's expenses for departments like the Department of Law and Human Resources and Fleet and Facility Management. Office of the Mayor is included in finance and administration, excuse me, and all citywide functions like payroll and risk management. So those categories are pretty much debt service and general administration. But if you really highlight what the core services are that are funded by the corporate fund, the general operating fund, it's police, fire, street, sands, and then it's every social service and every healthcare, mental health program provided by the city, every affordable housing program provided by the city. They all come out of this corporate fund. So it is the base operating service fund for the city of Chicago. Next slide, please, Annie. Now, the problem is, and this is the data directly from the city's own budget book, is there are projected deficits to occur on an ongoing basis in the corporate fund into the future. So let's talk about this for a second. That orange bar that you see cutting across the graphic is revenue. And that's how revenue is projected to grow without the changes that Mayor Brandon just put on the table. The light turquoise, lighter blue line that goes above it, that's how expenses are expected to grow into the future. And so if you look at 2026, you see there's a deficit of $1.2 billion roughly between anticipated revenue and anticipated expenses. That deficit will continue on for the next couple of years, and that's problematic. And it's also structural. So what does that mean? It means the design of those millions of little tiny revenue sources that feed the corporate fund is such that they don't grow with the economy over time. So they don't really quite keep up with inflation. Your costs do. So over time, what happens is your revenue falls well below the cost of maintaining current services, much less adding or expanding a program. And we know that, for instance, there are some significant shortages at Chicago budget for positions like uniformed police officers. Estimates in there vary from anywhere from 1,200 to on upwards of that. There are some shortages in a number of other key areas. The city literally doesn't have the fiscal capacity right now with the money that feeds it to continue providing the same level of police, fire, street, sands, and social services protection that it does now, much less be able to fill the unfilled positions that it needs to. So the bottom line is the city's fiscal problems are long-term, they are structural, they weren't caused by any one administration. They have developed over time because of a combination of a design of revenue that feeds the corporate fund that's really not a design that works in a modern economy, and costs that do grow in the modern economy. So next slide, please. So Mayor Johnson, when he approached the budget this year, said he was going to try to address that roughly $1.2 billion hole between revenue and expected expenses in two different ways. Some cost savings through spending cuts and efficiencies, and then through some new revenue sources. And we've sort of highlighted some of the main cost savings that the mayor put on the table in a couple of slides here. You can see there's some operational and organizational efficiencies that he put on the table. The biggest one of those, if you go to the next to the last box, there is some organizational streamlining that's going to eliminate some duplicative functions across departments, et cetera. Will save about 94 million, and there will be a payroll reduction. There are going to be a cut of 446 jobs, primarily in healthcare delivery, that were covered by some federal grant money that is no longer available. So since the city just doesn't have the money, those jobs will be cut. There will be a hiring freeze for non-essential workers, and so the bottom line is that initiative will save another 100 million. Go to the next slide, please, Annie. Then the city a few years ago under Mayor Lightfoot passed an initiative where it was making an additional payment into its pension systems over and above what state law required. So the first thing you should notice about what I just said is what state law required. State law determines how Chicago funds its pensions. City council does not. The mayor does not. It's a function of state law. And the state passed a piece of legislation that created a backloaded funding ramp that increases every year to make up for what has really been decades of underfunding the pensions, once again, created by a statutory framework passed by the state of Illinois that simply had Chicago putting into its pension systems a contribution every year that was significantly less than what was needed to fund the cost of the benefits being earned. And so that created the growth of debt over time, which compounded annually and created a really bad fiscal challenge for the city. And then the state said, well, we're going to solve your fiscal problem by forcing you to repay it in this backloaded way. All that said, under Mayor Lightfoot, she said, look, we can save a bunch of money if we prepay, put even more into the pension systems than what state law requires under this ramp. So the city has done that for a couple of years in a row. Brandon Johnson did that at the beginning of his administration as well. And the bond rating agencies like that. It's a fiscally responsible thing to do. And because it's a fiscally responsible thing to do, the interest rates for the city of Chicago's debt are somewhat lower because bond rating agencies look favorable on these kinds of actions. That's a good thing because it saves the city money on all its debt, right? Well, the fiscal situation confronting the city this year is so dire, a 20% operating deficit, that Brandon Johnson has proposed reducing the amount of the advance payment from about $238 million to about $120 million. So the net savings there is $117 million. Now, mind you, they're going to make the full contribution required by state law and a little bit more, just not as much as they initially anticipated putting in as an additional payment, simply because they're trying to balance a very big budget hole for the current fiscal year. And a couple of other things that weren't detailed in the budget overview very well by the mayor's office, where they're going to allocate some costs that are covered by the corporate fund now to some of those other funds the city of Chicago has that should more appropriately pay them, like the O'Hare Fund or the Water Fund, the Midway Fund, whatever. So the bottom line is, he put on the table, you look at that green number there, $411 million in cost savings, employment cuts, and other efficiencies to address the $1.2 billion hole. So a good chunk of the hole, roughly 40%, the mayor decided he would try to close by making city government more efficient and by cutting a few positions. Next slide, please. So then he put some recurring revenue options on the table that would generate money on an ongoing basis for the city. And I emphasize the recurring part of that. So when you have a structural imbalance like the city of Chicago does have, and your revenue growth will not keep up with your cost growth over time, there's really only two ways to solve that structural problem permanently over time, to actually resolve it. One is to bring your revenues up to your cost level, or the other is to bring your costs down to your revenue level. And of course, you could do some combination of the two. But recurring revenue is essential if you're going to deal with a structural imbalance. One-time revenue, and we're going to get to that next, one-time revenue only helps you get through the current budget cycle. And there's a similar hole in the following year that you have to fill. So a number of the major revenue increases that the mayor put on the table start with increasing that personal property lease tax on, excuse me, on cloud equipment and those kinds of things from 11 to 14%. He's also going to cut the motor vehicle lesser tax rate just because he thought that was more progressive way to go about revenue collection. Anyway, when you add all that together, it's going to generate $334 million in additional revenue. So it's a 40% jump from last year. That's a significant jump in revenue. The second big thing that he put on the table, and this has been all over the media, is a head tax. Basically, if you have a business with 100 or more employees, you would pay that are working at least 50% of their time in the city of Chicago. You will pay a head tax of $21 per employee per month, which is just about $25,000 per month tax for these businesses. Now, the mayor has noted that that's only 3% of the businesses in Chicago. It would generate $100 million in revenue. There's been a lot of resistance to this proposal. The mayor included it in his package because if you're familiar with his worldview and philosophy, he tries to find progressive revenue sources whenever he can. And by progressive, that just simply means revenue sources either paid by businesses or more wealthy people rather than low and moderate income families. The challenge with that, so I teach a master's class on fiscal policy, is that literally every tax and fee that funds state or local government is regressive, except for about two. So the income tax can be designed to be progressive if it has a graduated rate structure like the federal government does, where the rates get higher as incomes get higher. The inheritance tax is a very progressive tax because it's only paid by really rich estates. The city of Chicago doesn't have the authority to do either an income tax or an inheritance tax. So almost every revenue source available to the city is regressive. And it's not because that's what the city likes or wants. That's just the reality of tax policy. And I get a lot of oohs and ahs when I talk about this at the beginning of my classes, just because folks are all ready to fight the man and go for all those progressive revenue sources. I'm like, okay, find me some. Here's the textbook. And that puts them in a little different frame of mind. So this at least is a progressive revenue source. And that's why the mayor put it on the table. The challenge with it is it's not an ideal tax policy initiative for a couple of reasons. Number one, it creates a cliff, right? So at 99 employees, you don't pay any tax. At 100 employees, you pay a $25,000 a month tax. Businesses that are right on that edge are going to have a high marginal incentive to get their employee headcount down below 100. They just are, because the $25,000 a month, if you go over, that you get to save, that's not an insignificant amount of money. And so having this sort of cliff that zero below that amount and then full amount above that amount, that's just not the right way to do tax policy. You usually want to phase these things in on an incremental basis so that they're more tiered, that then there's less tax evasion, et cetera. Frankly, it'll also be difficult for the city to monitor this accurately over time. because the way the legislation or the initiative is drafted is they have to be full-time employees that spend at least 50% of their time in the city of Chicago. Well, what about telecommuting now and all those options? And how are you going to be able to verify whether or not an employee is spending 50 or 48 or 37 or 72% of their time in the city versus working remotely from at home? So there's going to be a number of challenges in enforcement with this. All that said, it generates 100 million in revenue, and the city used to have a head tax, but they got rid of it during the administration of Mayor Rahm Emanuel. So I think if folks are opposed to this, when I say folks, I'm mostly talking about the business community, people that have objected to this. What I'd really like to hear them put on the table is $100 million of new revenue they support to replace it, because 100 million is not chump change. And we have a very big deficit, and it's really the only truly progressive revenue source on the table. So if you want to take that out, I could appreciate there are some sound arguments for taking it out. And I get that as a tax policy person, but I think it's not really responsible to say, oh, just take it out and not have an alternative to plug in. You got to be solving the budget deficit issue in a constructive and collaborative way. So it's okay to object to something as long as you have an alternative that can plug and replace it, right? So I spent a little bit of time on this because you're going to read all kinds of stuff in this. It's going to be in the papers. I feel sorry for Alderwoman Cruz on this one because she's going to get more than one person contacting her, I would guess, about the head tax. So it's just going to be one of those difficult issues that the city council and the mayor are going to have to deal with. And then there's a couple of other little things that he put on the table that generate additional revenue that would be recurring. I'm not going to go through every one of them in here. If you jump all the way down to the bottom line on the next slide, please.
If I could just correct one thing you said on this slide, the cost to go from 99 employees to 100 employees would be about 24,000 for the year, about 2,100 for a month.
2,100 a month, right?
Just note.
Okay. So total recurring revenue is going to be $570 million. So if you go back to the savings, he got over 400 million in savings. He's getting 500 million in change from new recurring revenue. So he's building a path towards resolving the fiscal problems. And then if you move on, he also has put a number of one-time revenues on the table. Go to the next slide, please, Annie. So here it is. Okay, it's come up. So he has proposed declaring a record TIF surplus of $1 billion for 2026. And that's literally a third of the TIF proceeds that would be available to put into surplus. So it is a substantial amount, and it will generate a lot more for the city than initially projected. And so the city share of that $1 billion TIF declaration would be about $233 million. The CPS would get about another $552 million from it. The reason why they share at different levels, when a TIF surplus is declared, what happens is the taxing authorities, the city of Chicago, the Park District, CPS, share in that surplus money in accordance with how they share the overall property tax levy. So the city's overall share of the property tax levy is roughly around 27% every year. CPS is roughly around 54%. So of that $1 billion, roughly 54% would go to CPS, roughly 27% would go to the city, and then, the library, the Park District, et cetera, would get their cuts. This is a significant increase from what was initially anticipated from TIF surplus for the upcoming year. In fact, it's going to be 157 million more than what was initially thought would be in the TIF surplus for the year. Then the mayor has also improved revenue projections for the year. That's always my favorite budget line. I love, it's like, oh, we're short by 20 million. How do we make up for it? Oh, revenue is going to be better by 20 million. I've seen that at every state and local government I've ever analyzed. So I would really love to see if that revenue projection increase comes in, but that's a standard budgeting thing. It's really not a significant part of the solution. Asset sales, proceeds of financing, that's debt proceeds that are going to be used to cover some operating costs in this current budget. I'm going to talk about that for a second. So the bottom line is, in addition to the 570 million in recurring revenue, he's put 362 million in one-time revenue. One-time revenue means it's not there next year. So it gets you through this budget cycle, but you don't have that revenue to cover whatever this revenue was used to cover this year and next year's expenditures. So it does create ongoing holes. And then you see there's borrowing to cover other challenges that the city is facing in this budget. There's a retroactive pay raise that was owed to firefighters that they've now settled on, and a cost associated with some police misconduct lawsuits. That's included in the proceeds of financing of the 166 million noted above. Bottom line, this is debt proceeds, and it's usually poor fiscal practice to borrow to spend on current operating costs. And the way I explain that is, it's like you use your credit card to pay for your rent and your groceries. And the next month, you don't pay your full credit card bill off, and you use your credit card to pay for your rent and your groceries again. And then the third month, you now have a much bigger credit card debt that you can't pay off, and you can't even afford your full groceries anymore, but maybe you could cover your rent. So it creates some long-term costs that make it very difficult to sustain funding on current operations over time. That said, the mayor recognizes that, by the way. I mean, to the credit of the mayor and his budget office, they say, yeah, borrowing to cover operating costs is not our preferred thing to do. It's not the right fiscal thing to do, but these are unique situations. They're one-time costs. We're going to amortize them over a couple of years. These really aren't recurring costs that we will be seeing over and over again. It's a one-time back pay that we owe for these positions to the fire department. These are one-time, very big settlements that we're getting rid of, over 176 cases in one instance against one officer. So they're saying, because these are such unique occurrences, that it's more appropriate to utilize debt to handle them. I'm going to be agnostic on this. I very much understand the mayor's argument here. I think it's a rational argument. I'm always a little queasy whenever borrowing is used to cover any sort of operating costs, but these are relatively unique. They are relatively one time. I do know that there are ongoing costs associated with police misconduct lawsuits. The city does budget for those every year, but these were some fairly unique and fairly substantial cases that are being dealt with. Next slide, please. So this is the walk down, based on all that information I just provided to you, of how the budget deficit gets closed for the current fiscal year. The initial projected deficit in the corporate fund was 1.8 billion. There was another 21.7 million in investments that the city decided to make in these programs you see on the side, which increased the deficit to basically the $1.2 billion level that I've been talking about there. He put 400. My computer's going slow. He put $411 million in savings and efficiencies on the table. He put $528 million in recurring revenue on the table. He put $362 million in one-time non-recurring revenue on the table, some additional borrowing to the tune of $90 million. And net at the end of the day, he got rid of the deficit under this proposal for fiscal year 2026. However, next year, the city will face, at a minimum, because not even all the efficiencies and savings are recurring efficiencies and savings, right? The minimum shortfall would be, as you see in this little box down there, $678 million that the city will face going forward. So, Annie, if you pull up the next slide, I think it shows, yeah, that's the slide, shows nicely what's going on. Remember I told you the revenue for the corporate fund doesn't really grow with the economy while the revenue for the city's other funds do. And this really shows you that. So this adjusts for inflation, which means this is a real comparison over time. And what you see here is the blue line are all the other funds for the city of Chicago, the enterprise funds, the water funds, et cetera, other than the grant fund. And they are growing in real terms over time at a very nice rate, at a rate that exceeds standard inflation. Then you look at the green line. That's the revenue growth of the corporate fund. And what you see, that one little big blip up 2019 to 2020, there's some COVID money that's coming in the door. But you see that green line, COVID money again, and then it's curving back down and then into the red. So in fiscal year 2024, if you could line these things up on the screen and go up, the city had a projected $5.8 billion in revenue for its corporate fund. In 2025, that declined in real inflation adjusted terms to 5.6 billion. And in 2026, it declined again to 5.2 billion. So that's roughly a $540 million loss, $550 million loss over 2 years in revenue in real inflation adjusted terms. That extra little green blip that gets you back up to 6 billion, that's what the revenue would look like with the one-time revenue, with the efficiencies, and with and the recurring revenue that the mayor has proposed. Okay, next slide, please. So structural solutions, and there's a lot of things that can happen, not many of which can happen before the end of this budget cycle. So that's one of the challenges facing Alderwoman Cruz, is a number of the big structural reforms involve state action. And so, you know, it can't be done before this budget cycle is done. So she is really going to, you know, be nice to your alderwoman for the next couple of months. She is really going to be worked incredibly hard with some very tough decisions to make in the next few weeks. Because a lot of the structural reforms that can make a long-term difference require state action. But we're going to run through some of them, and some of them are in the city's control, and just put them on the table for you to know where they are. And Jason, just make sure I don't go over time, because these are potential reform items. So number one, there's the personal property replacement tax. It's a goofy sounding name, but what used to happen in Illinois was local governments, municipalities like the city of Chicago used to assess a tax against personal property of businesses, equipment, inventory, supplies, vehicles, those kinds of things. When the state passed its 1970 Constitution, businesses lobbied to have that tax eliminated and replaced with a tax on their profits. And their rationale was, look, a personal property tax is something we have to pay as a fixed cost before we're profitable. Just assess us on our actual profits and replace that old personal property tax with this profit tax. So the state did when it passed its 1970 Constitution. This is supposed to be a purely local revenue source. It replaces a purely local revenue source. I'm emphasizing that now because the state has done some janky things with this that we need to get the state to stop doing. But this graphic will show you the revenue generated under this. You go for this 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, all the way through 2020. Relatively stable, varying somewhere between 1.3 and 1.47 billion. It didn't generate any big jumps or leaps. It just changed moderately from year to year. And then all of a sudden, 21 jumped up 400 million. 2022, look at that. Jumped up 3 billion almost, 2 billion and change. Another big jump in 2023, and now it's declining. So why did we have those big jumps, and what does that mean for the city of Chicago's finances? At the end of the pandemic, when we were all allowed to go back outside again, there was a lot of pent-up consumer frustration that got spent. And that started a cycle of hyperinflation. And whenever you have a cycle of hyperinflation and prices start going higher and higher and higher and higher, businesses know that they could price gouge. They could basically take additional profit during these periods of high inflation because no one knows what's causing the increase in prices. And in fact, there's been tons of studies of these. The bottom line is, generally speaking, in periods of hyperinflation, corporate price gouging accounts for about 10% of the inflationary pressure. Increased wages placed to workers accounts for about 62%. And the rest of that inflation is caused by supply chain issues that you read about in the papers. Well, in the most recent period of hyperinflation that we just lived through, inflation caused by labor and wage increases was way down. It was only about 40% of the reason we were having this hyperinflation. Corporate price gouging was over 20%. So they really made book during this period, and you could see that reflected in these numbers. So what's that mean for the city of Chicago? Next slide. It means that this revenue source was able to hide some other structural flaws in the city's corporate fund revenue system. Between fiscal year 2020, you look at that big growth in revenue between 2020 and 2021, where revenue jumped from 200 million from the personal property replacement tax to 600 million. That is a monster increase on a year-to-year basis. Now, since that time, what you can see is it's starting to flow down and get back to historic levels. In fact, this year it's projected to be at only $203 million in revenue, which is about the same as where it was back in 2019. Okay, so it's really going back in time, and we're losing a lot of revenue for the city of Chicago, and that's creating a bunch of this pressure. Once again, this has nothing to do with decisions made at the city council, at the state, or whatever. Next slide, though. But what has to do with
Ralph, about 5 minutes remaining.
Okay.
To reclaim us. I'm going to make Annie the host again.
Okay, so what has to do with the city of Chicago's finances here and their relationship with the state, because the state does drive a lot of these things, is the state has decided to start taking some of the revenue from the personal property replacement tax, even though it's only supposed to be a local revenue source. Last year alone, the state diverted 11.5% of the revenue away from the personal property tax and away from local governments into the state. So Annie, if you go to the next slide, what that'll show them is that cost the state of Illinois, that cost the city of Chicago almost 36 million in lost revenue. State has to stop doing that. And that's a function of state law. I think if we could jump up to the next slide, the local government distributive fund. The state does share its income tax revenue with local governments. It used to share at a rate of 10%. Then the state increased its income tax rates. It said, we're not going to let the local government share in that increase. So they cut the share rate from 10% down to 6.4 or 6.8, depending on if the revenue came from the income of the corporate income tax or the individual income tax. If we just went back up to that old share rate, which they should do, by the way, the city of Chicago would realize an additional $290 million in revenue. That is a lot of revenue. It's a structural reform that needs to happen. And the final big structural reform I'm going to talk about is the pension. And so this is the pension ramp that was passed by state law. This is how the state has decided the city of Chicago has to repay the underfunding of its pension systems that the state made law for decades. This is how the state is fixing a problem the state created for the city of Chicago. You add those bars together, that's the total pension payment the city has to make every year to get the systems up to what's the target? 77% funded in 2055, Annie?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. That to get them 77% funded. They're only 27% funded today. That means they only have 27% of the assets they need to cover the liabilities they owe. We cut the payment into its two parts so you could understand what's really happening there. The blue bar, that's the cost of funding benefits being earned by state workers. See how small that is? The orange bar, that's the debt payment plan the state passed for the city. It's unaffordable, it's unattainable, it's ridiculously backloaded. So what we did at CTBA, next slide, is say, look, you look at that blue line that goes across the page, that's current law. So that's the total ramp under current law. we said if we change the payment plan and use some pension obligation bonds to prepay debt into the pension systems, and then re-amortize the debt on a level basis, change when the payment's being made, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line is, we could get the systems up to 82% funded, which is a higher funded ratio by 2055, for $10 billion less than the current state plan. And I know that Alderman Villegas has actually put in a resolution that encourages the state to allow the city to re-amortize its pension debt. But this is just a way to save taxpayers money and solve a problem that was created by state legislators, and really do it in a way that doesn't require either a tax increase or a spending cut. So there are other structural things and revenue sources available to the city. I am going to stop here, right, Jason?